I never really understood the full weight of my grandmother's warnings, not until it was too late. Growing up, I was always close to her. She lived in a quiet little house on the edge of town, surrounded by thick trees that whispered in the wind. It was the kind of place that had an eerie, almost haunting stillness to it, but to me, it was home. My grandmother was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, you listened. And when she warned me about her, the faceless woman, I brushed it off as just another one of her strange old tales. She used to sit me down by the fire and tell me things that seemed out of place, even for her. There was always a sense of urgency in her voice when she spoke of the faceless woman. "She's out there," she would say, her eyes darting around as if she were afraid someone was listening. "She doesn't show herself right away, but she watches and she waits." At the time, I thought it was just another one of those creepy stories she liked to tell, the kind that made me jump at every little noise in the house. I was a kid, after all, and I wanted to believe in something harmless. But my grandmother wasn't the type to scare me for no reason. She never told me anything frivolous. I remember one night sitting in her living room, the fire crackling, when she said something that made me shiver more than usual. "You may think it's all nonsense," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But mark my words, there will come a time when you'll know I was right. You'll see her." I laughed it off then, trying to ease the tension in the room. "Grandma, come on, a faceless woman? That's just a story." But she didn't smile. Her face grew serious, her wrinkled hands clenched around her cup of tea. "You won't be laughing when you see her," she said softly, almost mournfully. "She's not like anything you've ever seen, not like anyone you've ever known. And once she's seen you, there's no escape." I thought she was just being dramatic. Maybe it was her age, her mind playing tricks on her, or maybe she just wanted to get my attention. Either way, I didn't think much of it. But now, years later, as I sit in the very same living room, I can't shake the memory of her words, because now I've seen her. It all started on a chilly evening. I had just returned to my grandmother's house after a long drive back from the city. I had come to check on her, something I did every few weeks. But this time was different. She wasn't answering her phone, and when I knocked on the door, there was no response. Her house was locked up tight, but something felt off. The air was thick, heavy with an unsettling quiet. I pushed the door open, calling out her name, but there was no answer. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside. It was like something was wrong. I walked through the rooms, calling for her, my voice echoing against the empty walls. Finally, I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table, staring out the window. Her back was to me, but she was still, too still. "Grandma?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't turn around. It was as if she didn't hear me. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. There in the reflection of the window, standing just outside in the shadows, was a figure. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, stepping closer to the house. A woman, her silhouette almost blending into the darkness. And then I saw it, her face, or rather the absence of one. It was like staring into an empty void, a blank canvas where a face should be. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. Just smooth, featureless skin. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. I froze, not daring to move or make a sound. But then she saw me. There was no mistaking it. The way she tilted her head, as if she could sense my gaze, and then she smiled, or at least I think she did. It wasn't a smile of comfort or kindness. It was something darker, something colder, a smile that sent a chill through my bones. My grandmother hadn't told me everything. She hadn't told me how close the faceless woman could get, how real she could feel, how she could be right behind you before you even knew she was there. I ran then. I didn't know what else to do. But as I bolted for the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching, waiting, and somewhere deep inside I knew that it wasn't just a story anymore. It wasn't just a warning. It was a nightmare that had come to life. And that was only the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that faceless woman flashed in my mind. Her smooth, blank face staring into me, no eyes, no mouth, just emptiness. It felt as though the very essence of her presence was still in the room with me, lurking just out of view. When morning came, I was exhausted, but I had to find my grandmother, find out if she had seen what I had seen. I had to know if she was okay. I didn't want to face the truth, but deep down, I knew I had to. I found her in the living room, sitting in the same chair by the window, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the glass. She looked up at me as I entered, her expression unreadable. "Grandma," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I saw her. The faceless woman." She didn't seem surprised, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made my heart sink. "I know," she said softly. "I knew this day would come." I stared at her, unable to comprehend. "You knew? Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me more?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "I tried to prepare you, but you weren't ready. None of us are." "Who is she?" I demanded. "Why does she do this? Why did you warn me about her? Is she dangerous?" My grandmother's face softened, but her eyes clouded with something dark, something painful. "The faceless woman is not just a ghost. She's not a spirit or a demon. She is something far worse, something real." I leaned forward, desperate for answers. "What do you mean? What is she?" Grandma looked at me for a long time, her eyes filled with regret. "She's a memory, a reflection of lost souls, those who have lived in the shadows, those who have vanished without a trace. And when she finds someone, when she chooses you, she follows you, she watches, she waits, she doesn't leave until you see her. And once you do, it's already too late." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "But why me? Why now?" Her voice cracked. "She chooses at random. There's no rhyme or reason to it. She feeds off your fear, your confusion, your helplessness, and once you've seen her face, you're marked. There's no escaping her gaze." I wanted to scream, to demand that she tell me more, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I sat there, frozen in the tension between what I wanted to believe and what I knew to be true. I wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, but deep down, I knew I couldn't. "Grandma," I whispered, almost afraid to ask the question, "what happens after you see her?" She turned her gaze away, her eyes reflecting the weight of years, of fear. "There's no going back. She follows you, she never stops, and she takes what she wants." My heart began to race. "Takes what she wants? What does that mean? What does she take?" "Your soul," my grandmother answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not your life, but something far worse. She robs you of everything you are until there's nothing left. You'll still be alive, but you'll feel like a shell, hollow, empty." I stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it all. My mind was spinning, but the one thought that kept repeating in my head was clear. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before it was too late. But my grandmother stopped me. "You can't run, child. She'll find you wherever you go. It's only a matter of time before she catches up to you." "Then what do I do?" I cried out, my desperation rising. "You can try to outlast her," my grandmother said, her voice filled with the weight of someone who had seen this before. "You can try to live your life, to go on as if nothing is wrong. But she will always be there, lurking in the corner of your mind, and when you least expect it, she'll show herself again." I turned away, unable to process her words. The room felt suffocating. The air grew thick, almost heavy, as if the walls were closing in around me. I thought about the faceless woman standing outside the house, her cold, empty face staring through the window. I couldn't shake the image, couldn't forget the way she had looked at me, as if she had already claimed me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was imagining things. But that night, as the darkness settled in once again, the fear returned. It was subtle at first, just a creeping unease that lingered in the corners of the room. I tried to shake it off, to focus on something else, but my mind kept drifting back to her, the faceless woman. And then I heard something, a soft scraping noise, like the sound of something, or someone, dragging across the floor. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I glanced nervously around the room. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the chill of her presence, like an icy hand on the back of my neck. I held my breath, straining to listen. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was coming from outside the room, just beyond the door. And then I heard a whisper. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was clear, sharp, and full of cold intent. The words that followed made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have looked." I didn't need to hear anything else. I knew she was here, and this time, she was no longer a story. She was real, and I was trapped. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the door. My heart pounded so loudly that it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The whisper, the words, echoed in my mind like a death knell. "You shouldn't have looked." I backed away from the door slowly, my mind racing. I was being hunted, I realized. The faceless woman wasn't just an apparition, a figment of my grandmother's imagination. She was a predator, and I was her prey. The scraping sound continued, faint at first, then louder, growing nearer. I could hear her moving around the house, as if she knew exactly where I was, as if she could feel my fear and was feeding on it. I bolted for the window, trying to peer out into the darkness, but I saw nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind, casting long, twisted shadows on the lawn. No faceless woman, no sign of movement, yet I knew she was close. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, soft at first but insistent. I froze, unsure whether it was her or something else. "I know you're in there," the voice whispered, barely audible but chillingly clear. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The voice was so close now, as though she was standing right outside the door, her breath against the wood. My skin crawled with the knowledge that she was mere inches away from me. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Open the door. I want to see you." I could feel my pulse in my throat, my stomach turning with dread. The door was locked, but that didn't matter. I knew she could get in. She had been watching me for days, weeks, maybe even longer. There was no way out. I was caught in her web, and it was only a matter of time before she dragged me into her darkness. Suddenly the knocking stopped. Silence fell like a heavy blanket, suffocating the room. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the kind of silence that comes just before something terrible happens. I glanced nervously toward the hallway. The air was thick with tension. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind. She follows. She never stops. And then, just as I thought I might go mad with fear, the door creaked open on its own. The latch didn't budge. The knob didn't turn. But the door swung open slowly, as though pushed by an invisible hand. I stared into the hallway, my breath caught in my throat, my heart slamming against my rib cage. Nothing. The hallway was empty. It was silent. But I could feel her. I could feel the cold, the presence that pressed against me, like 1,000 invisible eyes watching me from the shadows. I stepped forward, my legs shaking, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I had to see if she was there, lurking just out of sight. I had to face this nightmare head on, because if I didn't, I knew it would destroy me. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and empty. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, inching my way toward the end of the hall, toward the living room. As I reached the door, I heard a soft click. It was almost like the sound of a door opening, but the only door in the living room was already ajar. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. My grandmother's chair was empty. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only a pile of cold ash in the hearth. The air felt still, almost suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then I saw it, a shadow, moving in the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. The room was silent again, but I could feel the weight of the unseen presence. She was there, watching. I knew what I had to do next. There was no turning back. I ran through the hall toward the front door. My feet barely touched the ground as I bolted out of the house, the cold night air slapping my face. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away. But as I ran, I heard something else, a sound I couldn't place at first. A soft rhythmic tapping, like footsteps following me in the dark. I glanced over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. Only the shadows stretching out long in the moonlight. And then I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing under the street lamp at the end of the driveway. It was her, the faceless woman. I stopped dead in my tracks. My body was paralyzed with terror. She was standing there, her form indistinguishable from the shadows around her. But it wasn't the absence of her face that terrified me. It was the way she was standing so still, as if waiting, watching, knowing that I would see her. And then she stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, her feet dragging against the ground, as though she was savoring every moment. I wanted to run, to get as far away from her as possible. But my legs wouldn't move, my body wouldn't obey. The tapping grew louder, closer, until I could hear the faint rasp of her breath. I could hear her whispering my name. "You can't escape me." I finally found my legs again and ran, not looking back, not daring to look. I sprinted down the street, through the darkened neighborhood, my mind screaming at me to keep going, to never stop. I ran until I reached the edge of town. But when I finally collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for air, I looked up and saw something that made my blood run cold. The faceless woman wasn't just following me. She was in the town, standing at every street corner, watching from every shadow. And now I understood my grandmother's warning. There was no escape. There was no running. The faceless woman was everywhere, and I was already too far gone. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the realization hit me like a freight train. I had been running, but there was no point. The faceless woman, she was already a part of me, part of my story and part of my nightmare. No matter where I went, she would find me. The fear, the dread, it was suffocating. I tried to calm myself, take a breath, but every inhalation felt like it was being pulled from me by invisible hands. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something awful to happen. The streetlights above flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward me as if the darkness itself had come alive. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting her to be there, just a few paces behind me. But no, there was no sign of her. Yet, something felt off. The air was thick with an unseen presence, the same suffocating sense that had plagued me since I'd first seen her. The feeling that she was always just behind me, in the corners of my vision, whispering in the dark. I decided to head back to my grandmother's house, despite every fiber of my being screaming at me not to. Maybe I could find some sort of answer, some way to end this. Maybe if I confronted it head-on, I could stop running, stop being afraid. I didn't know what to do anymore. I felt lost, trapped inside my own terror. As I walked, the night seemed to grow colder, the air biting at my skin, and the world felt smaller, more enclosed. The buildings around me closed in like a maze, each turn making me feel more isolated, more cornered. I began to question my sanity. Was this real? Was any of it? Or had I crossed some line, some invisible threshold, into a world where fear and reality blurred into one? I reached the street where my grandmother's house stood. It was as silent as the rest of the town. The windows were dark, lifeless. The door was still slightly ajar, just as I had left it, and the wind pushed the door open just enough to let me see inside. The same suffocating darkness seemed to pour out from within. But then I saw something else. A shape, moving in the shadows near the hallway. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. It was her, the faceless woman. She was standing in the doorway, her back to me. At first I thought she was looking in the direction of the living room, but as I focused, I realized she wasn't looking at anything at all. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, as though waiting, listening. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, the dread sinking deeper into my bones. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. Her absence of a face had always terrified me, but now, seeing her in the flesh, it was more than that. It was her presence. It was the way she was so empty. Her figure stood there, just outside the periphery of human understanding. I felt an overwhelming need to approach her, to understand why she was there, why she had come for me. It was a compulsion, like a magnet pulling me in, a force stronger than anything I'd felt before. I walked slowly toward her, each step seeming heavier than the last. As I crossed the threshold, I noticed something. The faint sound of a voice whispering my name. I turned my head, but no one was there. The whispering came again, louder now. "Come closer, child. I've been waiting." I hesitated. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something deeper, something primal, kept me rooted to the spot. The woman shifted, her head tilting further until it looked as if it was almost impossible for her neck to bend that way. But there was no pain, no strain in her movement. It was just wrong, like she was made of something that shouldn't exist. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her head slowly, ever so slowly, until I could feel the weight of her empty gaze upon me. There was nothing behind the smooth, featureless skin, just a deep, unending void. "You already know," she replied, in a voice that wasn't hers. It was soft, almost maternal, yet the coldness in her tone made my stomach churn. The words hit me like a slap across the face. I already know. How could I know? What was happening? Suddenly everything clicked into place. The pieces I hadn't even realized were scattered all around me came together. The faceless woman was not a ghost, not some external entity. She was me. I stumbled backward, my eyes wide with disbelief. The realization shattered me. My grandmother's warning. I had misunderstood it all along. My grandmother wasn't warning me about some external force. She was warning me about myself, about what I would become if I kept running from the truth. "I warned you," the faceless woman whispered again, the voice now chillingly familiar. "I warned you not to look, not to seek answers, but now you've found me." Her head tilted and she took a step closer. Her presence was overwhelming, crushing. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped. "I am what you are becoming," she said, her voice like ice. "The more you deny it, the closer you get." And then as she reached out for me, I understood. The woman was not an enemy. She was not an intruder. She was the manifestation of my deepest fear, the fear of becoming something I couldn't recognize, the fear of losing myself. The faceless woman wasn't hunting me. She was me, my future. With that final, horrifying truth, the world around me fractured. And just as I thought I might collapse under the weight of it all, the last thing I heard was a whisper, a final, terrible warning. "You can't escape who you are." And then everything went dark.